All right, in this video, we're going to take a look at the characteristics of life. These are things that all living things share characteristics. When you see the phrase prokaryotes and eukaryotes, that's referring to all organisms because all organisms can be characterized into one of those two classifications. All right, so in this video, you want to jot down the notes with me. We're going to take a look at 7 of these that you should know. Um, and the first one here, not in any kind of order, is to know that all living things are made up of cells. Now, that may sound common sense, but that's something you want to explicitly know. All right, now these organisms can be made up of one cell. We call that unicellular, or many cells. We call them multicellular. All right, so let's add that. All living things are made up of cells. Now, unicellular organisms do all these other functions in that one cell, whereas multicellular organisms often have specialized or differentiated cells, which just means that they have cells specialized at doing specific functions. All right, let's take a look at like the cells on the screen here may have a specialized function to protect this organism. Looks like these are structured on a leaf to protect it from insects. So this is an example of a multicellular organism. Another thing all living things do is that they have to obtain energy. They have to use energy, but in order to use energy, they have to obtain it. Right? So there's two ways. Let's add that to our list. There's two main ways that living things can obtain energy. Right? But we're going to write obtain, and then they're going to use energy. All right, add this to your notes. All right, one way organisms can obtain energy is to produce their own food. When we say obtain energy, we're often referring to food. And these are known as autotrophs. So in this image, what would be an autotroph? In other words, what would produce its own energy or produce its own food, which uses for energy? That would be the producers in this image, the tree, the grass. They're able to make their own food, which will later be used for energy. The other main way organisms can obtain energy is by ingesting other organisms. And so these are known as heterotrophs. All right, so look at this image again, and which of these organisms would you consider being heterotrophs? Well, these are your consumers, like the caterpillar eats the leaf of the tree. Well, the tree is another organism, so the caterpillar is a heterotroph. The bird eats the caterpillar. Bird is a heterotroph. Now, it doesn't just have to be eating. When that bird dies, the bacteria in the ground can ingest or absorb the nutrients from the dead bird to get its food. So these are all examples of heterotrophs obtaining energy. All right, our next characteristics of life is that all living things grow and develop. Whether it's a single cell organism or multi-cell organisms, all living things start as a cell and then they grow and develop. Well, there's no subcategory in here. This one is another one that may seem obvious. All organisms reproduce. Now, if you didn't reproduce, that population or that group of organisms would die out, and at least that would become extinct, at least that population. All right, so in this image, you have special reproductive methods to make that successful. You have a fish here protecting its eggs in its mouth, and that's one way it helps it successfully reproduce and pass down its genes. One thing to note is that not all living individuals reproduce. Or in other words, there are certainly individuals that are unable to or just don't reproduce offspring. But when you're talking about a population as a whole or a species as a whole, it does have to reproduce to avoid extinction. So the two main ways that organisms can reproduce is known as asexual reproduction, and uh, that's when you have one parent producing offspring. Okay, and you also have sexual reproduction. That's when you have two parents. All right, so there are advantages and disadvantages to each type of reproduction. The main one is courtship and variation. So in the image here with the bunnies and the rabbits, they reproduce sexually. So a, a mom and dad rabbit to produce bunnies. Now, in order for mom or dad to attract each other, they have to use time and resources. They have to have the looks and the and behavior to attract the mate. So that takes up time and resources. That's a disadvantage. All right, but the advantage is that their offspring have variation. All right, so with that variation, they're more likely to that group is more likely to survive. All right, whereas down here, this is an example of a asexually producing animal. It looks like a plant, but it's an animal. It's called a hydra. All right, and so this doesn't need to waste time and energy in looking for mates. When it's ready to reproduce, it simply buds off an offspring. So that's the advantage. It doesn't have to use time and resources in finding a mate. But the disadvantage is the offspring is not gonna have much variation. It's gonna look pretty much identical to the parent. And so it's going to be more prone to disease and being wiped out by a predator, let's say. All right, one thing I want to bring your attention to is these misconceptions, right? These are common things that students incorrectly perceive to be true. Okay, so one thing is that oftentimes students think just because something is made up of one cell, it reproduces asexually. That's not always true. There are unicellular organisms that reproduce sexually, right? On the other side, there's multicellular organisms that reproduce asexually and sexually as well too. So don't associate one with the other. The unicellular and multicellular organisms, there are examples of each reproducing sexually as well as asexually. All right, next thing is that all living things have to have some kind of genetic information. Oftentimes, this is known as DNA. So for now, we'll just write DNA, right? And we'll find out later that DNA has the information to make proteins. All right, all living things have to be able to respond to changes in their environment. All right, so environment, things change all the time, and a living thing will respond to those changes. We call those changes stimuli or stimulus. All right, so in this image, you have a seedling leaning toward the sunlight. So that sunlight is a change in the environment, and it's responding to it by leading toward it, because it wants that sunlight. If you were to unplant this and move it to a different location, over time it'll change to a new angle to face that new direction of the sun. Another example would be like if you were to see a cockroach in your room. All right, that's a change in your environment, and you might want to scream. That's your response. Or you might want to go after it and try to step on it, and that would be your response. All right, you're doing that because you're alive and you recognize that change. Or on the flip side, the cockroach sees you and you are the change in its environment, it might try to run away. All right. Now, if it wasn't alive, it wouldn't do any of that. Just it wouldn't respond to you at all. So those are some other examples of response to stimuli. All right, next one is homeostasis. There's a whole unit is dedicated to this as unit 4. So we'll get into more detail then, but homeostasis is just the process of maintaining stable conditions inside the body. All right, and these are the examples that will be on your test: temperature, pH, glucose, water, and solid. We'll get to these in unit 4, but for now, just know that all living things somehow maintain stable internal conditions, and that's called homeostasis. So let's add that. All right, and finally, evolution. All right, in a lot of textbooks, evolution is a characteristic of life. I want to add that, but we'll add that with an asterisk. Um, tell you why. So it's true. All living things, as a species or a population, a group, do evolve, but it does require a population. Okay, so there's some criteria here. In other words, a single living thing, an individual, we call that, doesn't evolve. Like a single rabbit, a single tree, a single person, like these can't evolve on its own. It needs a population. It needs a whole group of them. And not only that, as we'll see in unit 7, unit 7 is about evolution, is you need generations of time. Don't just say a long time, because some things don't only need a few minutes to reproduce. So it's better to say generations of time. All right. So if you had a hundred rabbits over generations, so those rabbits reproduce and make baby rabbits, and those baby rabbits grow up to reproduce and produce more baby rabbits, and over generations of, then yes, you can observe evolution. And all living things, all groups of populations do that over time. But you just got to be careful saying it's not correct to say um, a rabbit evolved into from a white rabbit to a brown rabbit because it moved from the snow to the forest. That doesn't happen. All right, so get a blank sheet of paper and see how much of this you can recall from scratch, and keep at it. Practice until you've mastered these 7 characteristics of life.